our point of view on why we are in this massive opportunity and why biology is changing so rapidly is we're gradually unlocking the ability to read and write biology at every layer of the system.
Erum, do you feel like summer's in the air?
Yes, it is here. I'm so excited. I mean, I thought we were going to have spring earlier because the very scientific process of Punxsutawney Phil, the groundhog, said we would have more spring, and it didn't seem like it actually happened. So I don't know what happened. I thought that was an accurate measure of weather, but apparently it isn't. But summer's here. And what does that mean? What does that summer mean for you? How do you usually kick off summer, Karl?
I'm looking forward to spending time in the Adirondacks and always just being outside. So at some point, I think listeners of the Grow Everything podcast know that I do spend some time in the Adirondacks. I relocate for a couple of weeks. I'm not sure that's going to be the case this year, but just being around nature and appreciating how nature grows as a constant reminder of the Grow Everything podcast is something I appreciate. How about you?
For sure, outdoor time is what I've been craving. The nature of our job, we're always in front of computers. We're indoors right now, but being outside just completely changes my disposition in life. Just being able to breathe air, being amongst the trees, doing my own type of forest bathing, which is all the rage right now, just being under trees. What kind of biomolecules are floating around that's influencing my mood, my health? That's really interesting. And even the sun. There was a festival in your neighborhood, which I know you just kind of walked through, but it was just super sunny all day. I got overdose of vitamin D, I'm sure, which a lot of people need these days. And that's what I'm really looking forward to, going on hikes, looking at trees, being in tune with nature. I think that really helps with even just making decisions in your day-to-day life in terms of how you're consuming things and trying to be a little bit more mindful. So that's my little soapbox for going outdoors. I hope that people that are listening to this pod are listening on headphones and they're going for a walk or driving to somewhere outdoors. That would be amazing. But summer is also still full of events. It's still full of biotech events. I'm sure our friends at Taconic or West End Labs, they have a beautiful lab space in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and they've done just great parties. I was going to say networking events, but they're beyond networking events. They're just parties. And they have great people in their community that are pit masters. So they do barbecues on the rooftop. What a fun way to celebrate biotechnology and just being around like-minded people. But you've been to events. You already kicked off the summer event season. You went to one yesterday. Where'd you go and what'd you do?
So I went to a Biopharma event that I honestly didn't get to until late in the day. It was one of these events that was put on by an investment bank. So they had 3 tracks going on all day long, giving you the opportunity to sit in on meetings with biopharma companies that are looking for investments. And because I got there late, I basically just got the list of all the companies, and then I got to listen to a panel on the impact of artificial intelligence on drug discovery. And I have to say, I was very much underwhelmed by the panel.
Oh, wow.
The guy who ran the panel could have used some media training.
Snap.
Every question he asked was like 5 questions in one. So it made it very difficult for the 2 people who were on stage to really answer any questions. But they did. But I felt like the level of information, I'm going to be generous and say probably it was like 3rd to 5th grade. Let me just say it this way. If you didn't know anything about drug discovery and AI, you would not be psyched after listening to these panelists. And one was a guy who's been in the pharmaceutical industry for more than 30 years, making the point that AI is nothing new. Big Pharma has been using AI for many years, which is true. And then the other person who is much younger than him is at a new drug discovery company focused on antibody development. She was actually very good, but I don't feel the questions did her justice. So I would say that that panel, especially compared to what we heard at SymBioBeta, like let's just say SymBioBeta was grad level, super exciting. Here's the applications of artificial intelligence to all biology, not just drug discovery. That's graduate level and perhaps a little overhyped, but very exciting. I felt like this panel was underwhelming and did a disservice to the investors in the room, because the room was filled with investors and the level of information that they were given was probably like in elementary school, and it did not feel up to date. I walked away very, very disappointed and felt like it was a waste of time.
Oh, snap, Karl. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think you definitely make your voice heard. I'm really curious about the one panelist who said that AI has been in drug discovery for years. Is that on the chemical synthesis side or is it on the biology side? Did they highlight any specifics?
So he did mention that it was on the chemistry side, and I think probably thinking about combinatorial chemistry. He did talk a little bit about protein structures, but they didn't even mention AlphaFold 3. It was one of these things where they're talking about structure, but they didn't talk about function. He didn't really make it sound like it was an unsolvable problem. I just felt like the information was already outdated. They're talking about things that were maybe true a few years ago, but didn't take into consideration what's going on now. Now, it is worth saying that we are still new to AI and drug discovery. We have been paying close attention to it. We've been seeing people for the last 2 years just talk about AI in drug discovery. And we have clients that are doing drug discovery using AI. So I feel like we know a little bit, but are humbled by the amount of knowledge that there is and the pace that things are moving at. And from an investor point of view, you need to understand where the field is going. So understanding that AI is going to become the language of biology because of how complicated it is, that AlphaFold and these protein databases are so big and they're starting to show function. I think it changes the game for pharma. And the two areas where they didn't even mention it is process development, fermentation, drug production, and then also when it comes to clinical trials. That whole space is ready to be disrupted by AI, identifying patients, creating trials that are smaller. Yes, AI is very useful for the regulatory part of pharma. But anyway, I don't want this to be a podcast.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think a lot of it boiled down to the specifics. I mean, what does AI mean to different people? I don't know, even if people know, do they just think of computers or are they really thinking of large data sets and how do they interact with each other? And how are these algorithms created? I mean, we use ChatGPT and we notice how bad it is at some things, especially when it comes to science communications. And it's honestly very basic. When we try to prompt it and we do an effort in creating unique prompts and thinking about the engineering of those prompts, but it still comes up with all the data it has access to. And that data is basic, especially when it comes to communications and you need to break through the noise. You really need to look for something creative and unique. And that's not really what's churning out.
Yeah.
So what data sets are available? Are they real-time data from some type of source, or is it a historical data? And how has that data been captured? And I think that's a really big part of the conversation that needs to be had is like, what are the very specific variables that need to be taken into consideration? Because that's what investors would need to know to make better decisions and where to put their money, which frankly, sometimes it seems like they're putting it in the wrong place. They just see someone from Stanford and they're like, okay, versus maybe someone someone from a different school and they have a really great science, really great business. I mean, I'm just trying to make a point is that if investors don't have the correct information about the actual product and how it works and what does it need in order to be a better product and to scale up, then what else can they make a decision on? Or it's a non-decision. So right now, it's not a really good investing climate. Maybe it's because a lot of investors still aren't having a very clear understanding of what's going on in AI. And they just feel like, all right, well, since it's cloudy still for me, I'm just not going to put some money down. I'm just going to wait until something happens. Things are happening, of course. But yeah, that's so interesting. When you told me about your disappointment in this finance event, I'm like, oh, of course, like they have all the money, but not all the information. Let's just get everyone in a room. Or we should just go there and have an event and be like, hey, just pay attention to these very specific variables, which you would have to do some more research on, of course.
Yeah. So you mentioned that funding has been a challenge, which is absolutely true. But there were a couple of statistics that I heard last night, which I think made me feel pretty good. And I mean, listen, I was glad I went to this event. It's always good to go to events, and finance events are their own beast. It's good to hear other people talk about what they're interested in. But there were two statistics that I thought were interesting that we should just point out to people. So one is that more than $30 billion in M&A transactions in biopharma have been announced. So that's a huge amount. And apparently that amount outpaces anything that was going on from an investment point of view in biopharma in 2023. Another stat that is interesting that is related to biopharma is $200 billion in pharmaceutical revenues are expected to come off patent in the next 10 years. So pharmaceutical products come off of patents after a specific amount of time. And that means those drugs can become generic. So as a result, biopharma always needs more strategic collaborations. They need to be doing more business development. They need to fill their pipelines. And where do they fill their pipelines? They fill them with startups and small to mid-level biotech companies. So there is a huge amount of opportunity for innovation, and that's really where the changes are going to happen. Yeah.
There's a big playing field. I think one of the things when I think about pharmaceuticals is I really think the industry is coming to a reckoning, especially as we learn more about biology. One of the takeaways that I had highlighted from SynBio Beta was a lot of what our friend Paul Stamets said, but other people, Frank Jask from Iona Bio also pointed out the concept of small molecule versus entourage effects. In the world of biology, things work in concert with each other. It's not just one thing that's responsible for every outcome. As we learn more, and this is also one aspect of machine learning or AI to investigate, is the multitude of interactions that happen between different molecules. And how does that influence our biological systems? So with Frank Jask of Iona Bio, they do a lot of plant cultures because plants have a lot of different biochemical pathways versus, let's say, persistent fermentation, when you're really having some culture in a bioreactor and you're trying to produce one molecule. So this concept of one molecule versus multiple molecules, I'm really curious to see how they differ, what's the efficacy between the two. Even in the last episode, I mentioned the difference between synthetic psilocybin versus the actual mushroom, and there's different effects between the one molecule versus more. And how does AlphaFold play into all of this when it is now being able to predict the interactions between proteins and other biomolecules? Can this help us understand entourage effects and help us predict different formulations or different experiments that we can do to then verify that, yes, we can't just use this one molecule. It should be a multitude of molecules to be able to have this therapeutic effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Small molecules have proven to be very effective, but it makes me wonder how much more effective they could be if you took that entourage effect into consideration, especially since that's the way so much natural medicine or indigenous medicine has in the past worked.
Yeah, and I would say too that small molecules have efficacy, but there's also a lot of side effects. Okay, $200 billion in pharmaceutical revenue from these off-patent drugs. I don't know if really new, very innovative biopharma companies are going to really care because they want to come at it from a new place. But now there's so much more that we can, there's so much more insight now that we can come at drug development in a different way. So I'm very curious to see how this all shakes out. I mean, I think that pharma needs to pay attention. If they want to put their money to acquire more startups, as long as they give them the agency to continue doing what they're doing, I think we'll be in good shape. But let's see how that shakes out.
You said pharma's reckoning is coming. And I just remember that Marcus Schindler of Novo Nordisk said, pharma's not ready for disruption. They don't think about disruption. And upstarts do come along and disrupt industries. I want to find more examples of biotech disrupting big pharma. But the example that I always think of is Instagram and Kodak. 2-3 guys completely changing an industry by creating a sharing app that had been at the pioneer of digital photography. Kodak invented it, but they never took it seriously. And where's Kodak now?
Yeah, and it seems like pharma companies like BioNTech and Moderna came out of left field. I never really heard of them when I started my career, which again was a long time ago, who are the next pharma players that either create something unique. It's just always a matter of them either getting acquired or they merge or maybe they make it on their own. So it's something to pay attention to. And then also the consumer. I think a lot of it is like, okay, if we can understand how our biology works, maybe we can do things to restore our own health better, that we don't necessarily rely on taking pharmaceutical drugs, which again, some people do need. There's a disease that it's just hard to change a lifestyle, or you can't. Obviously, there's some cancers that you definitely need drugs for, some on the rare disease front, but maybe there's other things. So I don't want to be like a natural healer, woo, 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 but
this podcast is called Grow Everything, people.
Yeah, let's grow everything. Let's grow pharmaceutical drugs. They all also come from plants too. Let's be real. And obviously, there's synthesized chemicals, and that's a whole nother episode. We can talk about the difference between synthesized vitamins and vitamins you get from plants, because the synthesized vitamins don't work, people. It's just the nature of their structure and how they actually work in biology. But okay, I'll get off my little soapbox here. I'm going to fall off of it.
All right. So our last episode was about SynBioBeta. We got some great feedback from that. We clearly have been growing a community. I don't know. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we get into today's episode, Erum?
Yes. So SynBioBeta, we got a lot of great feedback. We had an amazing, I didn't really think of it as amazing until people told us of our networking episode. So if you haven't listened to our networking episode, we've been getting a lot of great feedback. It's a great thing to listen to before you go to events, or even just to contemplate an event that you've been to. And we met so many amazing people. We're like, we need to really create a community here with our listeners, our guests who are phenomenal. Our listeners are phenomenal as we met them at SynBioBeta and other events. And we know that people want to contribute somehow. So we want to give people the opportunity to become a Patreon. In our show notes, there's a link to our Patreon page. And people that become Patreons, we are going to do very, very, very special things for them. We're not going to say what now, because we have a list. We need to dwindle it down, but we want to see how our community grows. But we'll do things like share special products that are coming out, whether they're made with synthetic biology or just some of the guests that are on our podcast. We would love to share some of their products with our Patreon members. Event invites. We also want to recognize a lot of the listeners that have reached out to us and gave us unique insights or recommended guests, or that are just asking the right questions. Science is all about asking the right questions. So we want to recognize those people. And of course, have everyone speak to each other. So we have great guests that have specialized knowledge. We have great listeners that have specialized knowledge. What can be created within a community? So please join today. Go to our show notes, become a Patreon. We would love for you to be a part of our community. Speaking of community, we have a great community leader who we are interviewing today. It's Mr. Tony Kulesa of Pillar VC. I had a chance to meet him several times. Karl, you've met him before several times. He is a pillar to the Pillar community, to our community. And how did you meet him? How did you meet Tony? And I'll share my story.
I honestly can't remember how Tony and I connected, but I feel like you're right. We've had several conversations, and I was excited to do this interview because it's been a while since he and I had connected and caught up. Mm-hmm. How did you meet him?
I actually saw him speak at different events. I saw him speak at SynBioBeta. I saw him lead the founder-led summit that Pillar hosted. I think this was in 2021 or 2022. It was amazing. He was the MC and hosted panels, transitioned between these virtual panels and virtual speakers. And I was just amazed by, obviously, his intelligence, but his ability to bring people together to talk about their work in a way that speaks to the economics and commercialization of what the science can do and is doing. I was like, wow, this guy is a genius. And then I had a chance to meet him at an event in New York City, which was co-hosted between Pillar and Nucleate and some other organizations. And there was a line of people waiting to speak with him. And this was, again, an evening event and drinks and food. He was just talking. And I actually felt a little bad because everyone else was enjoying all of the food and drink, and he was just nonstop talking to people. So I was like, this guy needs something. Oh, actually, I said, do you want anything to drink? And he said, please get me water. And I did that, and I had a chance to talk to him because I really was feeling a lot of empathy for him at that point. He has a very calm demeanor, but it is very mission oriented. He sees that a lot of work needs to be done. And I think I'll just leave it at that because everyone's going to get to hear Tony Kulesa talk about how biology is changing the game.
All right. Tony Kulesa, welcome to the Grow Everything podcast. We're thrilled to have you here today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
We've known each other for a while. I think we've known each other more virtually than in real life. Erum and you have met more than once, so I feel bad that we've actually never met in person. But we're super excited to have you here to talk about Pillar VC and what you're doing. So why don't you give us a little bit of background on Tony Kulesa and then some background on Pillar VC, how you ended up there and what you do?
I definitely take inspiration from all the major kind of figures in my family. My grandfather was an engineer, worked on various projects in space, and was an electrical engineer before there was really a well-developed kind of field. He was a physicist turned electrical engineer, control engineer. That's really interesting for me to talk to him about. As I was growing up, and I still am doing really well, it was interesting to see the things that he had worked on, the trajectory of technology that took, working everything on space programs, but everything even to today's systems that we have. And so when I started off in college, my dad is also an electrical engineer. I started off in electrical engineering, but I feel like that field was already well established. And I wanted to do the thing that, just like my grandfather became an electrical engineer, like before there was really well developed field around it, I was like, what would that look like for me? I don't want to use the 30th edition of the textbook, and would have like a similar kind of arc of impact in my career. I would say like I did not foresee, I started college in 2008 and finished in 2012, and the deep learning kind of revolution happened in 2012. So I missed that and I didn't foresee it. I felt like the field was fairly static at that point. And I thought the place to be that where the textbooks are still being written, where there'd be like the most progress over my career would be biology. And she was like, I mean, I don't need to tell you guys, but we're biology. Everything that we eat is biology and everything's biology. And so as we unlock our ability to control it and design it, you just imagine the sky's the limit of what you could do with that. So I rapidly pivoted into that in my undergrad years, and I haven't looked back since. I came to Boston about 12 years ago to come to grad school at MIT, and I did a PhD in biological engineering there. I think the MIT biological engineering department has been distinctly trying to create a whole field of biological engineering, as opposed to a lot of departments around the country are about electrical engineering, mechanical engineering applied to medicine. MIT is one of the places where they were really trying to create a field where biological systems were like a first-class citizen. You would develop a whole new way of thinking about just engineering them, with them being the basic atoms of the system. That's where I ended up and loved doing research. That's how I got into biology and bioengineering.
That is a great story. And I love how you tied in your family and you have this legacy of working on the edge of research and engineering. And at MIT, since we're on the topic regarding your research there, you worked on new platforms for drug discovery and microbial therapeutics. Could you share some insights into these inventions and their potential impact on biotechnology?
So the way I would describe it is, if you look at what makes biological systems so powerful, it's really this concept of self-assembly. When you hybridize DNA, you don't take two little tweezers and put the strands together. The strands automatically find each other based on self-complementarity, and then they will hybridize. And so you can have like many different strands of DNA in one solution that will find their mate pairs and hybridize together all at once. And that scales. It's not true that it scales infinitely, but the first order basically scales infinitely, which is very different from how we think about the systems that we build as humans. If you look at how cars are built, they're built one step at a time. They're built on an assembly line. You move the car forward. And so I think the way I would describe what I worked on in my PhD was like, how can we make some of the things that we do more akin to how biology does them, so that they're much more scalable and robust? In particular, although you can take DNA molecules or proteins or something and they self-assemble in solution, the next unit, like how we work with biology, which would be moving little liquids around that carry cells or carry various media or drugs or things like that, we don't have a way of self-assembling all of that in reaction. So if you look at how you do a drug screen, for instance, you usually have a plate where each well in the plate contains one drug and cells. You do them one by one, and there's no way to do the entire thing in parallel. The system that I worked on was basically like, let's take any biological reagent we care about, cells, media, drugs, etc., and put them in little water droplets. And if we want to basically make all possible combinations of, say, cells and drugs, imagine you have different cell lines, one from each kind of tissue in the body, and you have a whole library of like all FDA approved drugs. You want to make all pairs of them. rather than taking like a robot one by one, like squirting the cells and then squirting the drugs one by one, what if we could just do it all in one shot? And the way that we saw was put them in little water droplets. And we would actually make little micro wells where you would take a solution of oil that's actually carrying these little water droplets and flow them into this large array of micro wells, such that the droplets randomly pair, or you could make any number, 3, 4, etc., but randomly self-organize into these micro wells. And then you would have effectively constructed every pair. And we also created a way where you could then read out the identity of what was in each well after it had been assembled. So instead of taking a robot and doing it one by one, you would just have one squeeze of the pipette and you would just get all possible combinations. And so we applied that to drug screening. And actually one of the more interesting applications that we discovered, which I didn't think of, it wasn't until Jared Kay, who was another grad student, came into the lab and saw the technique, and he was independently interested in this, but we discovered is actually probably the most powerful application we come up with was making microbial consortia to treat disease. So your body is populated with microbes in your gut and on your skin and various other places. And we think those are important to your health, and especially in ways to interact with your immune system. I'm not involved, but Jared and Sherry Ackerman and other folks from the group spun out a company called Concerto Bio, which they now is doing great. That's one really interesting application, is discovering these microbes that you can use as therapeutics. I think the Blaney lab at MIT, where all this work was done, and Paul Blaney was a really important figure in it, and continue to develop it for other applications.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
How do you go from doing that kind of research and that fundamental work to starting a venture fund?
Well, I started an incubator. I wouldn't say I started a venture fund. So, I love doing science. In fact, I'm almost compelled to do it. There's a quote from Yuri Lan, which is like, I can't be myself without some buffer on the shelf. And I feel like that really describes me. For example, like for when my son was born, I took fecal samples from his diaper and put them in my freezer and looking at the development of the infant microbiome, for instance. I'm compelled to do it. But I realized that I was not the best scientist. I was pretty good, but I was not the best. And I think if you look historically, or say the likelihood, like let's imagine this year some amazing discovery happens. What's the likelihood that it's from me versus some of the other people that I was extremely privileged to work with? And I was like, it's far more likely from them than from me. So I thought, although I love science and I love actually being in the lab, it probably wasn't the thing I was going to make the most impact with. But the thing that I actually got really intrigued by was a meta problem, which is not any particular science problem, but it was the fact that in my PhD program, there's 150 students, say something like that. If you zoom out, there's 12,000 new PhDs in the life sciences that are graduated every year. There's 86,000 active NIH grants. There's 60,000 life science faculty in the US. This is just academia. And if I looked at the translation rate, one way of looking at it would be how many of those projects become new startups or something that then go off to impact the world. You would be shocked that the number is 200 to 300 per year. I thought that is the thing I could have an impact on, is try and unlock not my particular interests in science, but just the general problem for all scientists, how to make it easier for them to start companies. The venture firm where I now work, called Pillar, I got to know some of the folks there because they were actually backing some of the friends of mine in starting companies. I think it was a very unique thing to do at the time because most people, when I was doing my PhD, wanted to become professors. It was extremely rare that grad students would go and start companies. In fact, I was only aware of one example. And at that time, I hope it wouldn't offend them to say, I don't think it was a real company. The only team that I knew that had done that were the founders of Ginkgo. And they weren't really a real company at that point. Basically, it built a lab and were doing some consulting for like local biotech companies, but they're not the Ginkgo. They were very, very far from the Ginkgo that you would know them as today. I think, were in soul searching mode of, if we were going to make this a company, what would it be? They were like dumpster diving for used equipment. They were like working really hard to get these small consulting contracts. It did not look like a super glamorous thing to do. It was not a common thing for students to think like, oh, I should go take my PhD work or something related and try and bring this into the world as a company. But there were a few students that were starting to do that. Myself was one of them. There were not a lot of venture firms that would support that, but Pillar was one of the uniquely the firms that was. And so they had backed a couple of friends of mine who started companies, and I got to know them. We realized, I think that there is this inflection happening, and I could talk a little bit more about why that was the case. We thought that there was this cultural inflection happening where there were a lot of grad students of my cohort or something that were interested in this, and there was really no place for them to go. As I got to know Jamie Goldstein in particular, we thought, why don't we make an incubator, try and help maximize the chance of success of the scientists that want to leave academia and start these companies. We were really lucky in actually co-founding it with a number of luminary leaders across bioengineering companies, Emily LaProuse from Twist, Reshma Shetty from Ginkgo, et cetera. And I think we were quite successful at helping these companies get started. On all, we did 13 of them. And this was all funded and co-founded by Pillar as an experiment to see what it would be like to build a kind of dedicated team and vehicle to helping these things get started. What we didn't predict at the time that we were doing this was just how fast it would grow. You have to contextualize it, and there's a lot of reasons why it grew this fast. COVID happened. I think that changed a lot of things culturally just based on like the urgency, spread culture really fast, et cetera. But it just exploded. And it suddenly felt like we were just getting overrun with people that want to start companies. We decided to actually merge Petri into Pillar and become the basis of the biotech practice, which we've now been building. And since we recruited several other folks to join the team, like Thomas DeFlam, Madeline Hard, et cetera, and we've built a dedicated biotech practice based on the work that we started with Petri inside of Pillar now.
So you started Petri as an incubator, and Pillar funded the incubator, or did they also fund the very specific projects?
Yeah, the incubator funded them, and Pillar had supplied all the funding for the incubator.
For each of the companies that you would have come on?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then in terms of the incubator, I know there's a typical incubator program, but did it have a lab associated with it? Where was it based? What did you offer?
We did have a lab, but actually the lab was open for 1 month until COVID happened and shut us down. It was actually surprising because we realized that when you're starting these companies, actually, if you're a scientist, your kind of default mode is to go in the lab and do your lab work. And it was actually, I think, quite healthy to be forced not to do that and to think, is this exactly the right thing that I should do that creates the most value for the company? And often it wasn't. Often there's many other things that should be done before you go set foot back in the lab. Actually, I think we realized that the lab wasn't the most value inflective thing that they should be doing. And we should focus on team building, figuring out exactly how to apply like the various technologies that each company was developing, figuring out regulatory pathways, figuring out the right advisors, partners, et cetera, like licensing tech out of the universities. Doing all of that work positioned the companies much better than if they had continued on their trajectory in the lab.
So, Tony, it's interesting to hear you talk about this in the context of COVID, but also you mentioned that there was an inflection point. I mean, what kind of happens is, I think when you're in startup world, it seems like everybody's doing a startup, but it's true. You've had programs like what you guys are doing, and then like now Nuclei. So you have these vehicles that have been created to make it easier for life science PhDs to consider starting companies. Where do you see the inflection point happening? Was it COVID or was something else?
I really think COVID was a really inflective moment. What we discovered was the main limiting factor was culture in a few different ways, but let's just focus on academia for a second. So MIT trumpets itself as like this very entrepreneurial place. You show up on campus the first day, they say something like revenue from the alumni of MIT run companies is the 10th largest economy in the world or something like that. And I don't know where that number comes from, by the way. They trumpet this. And then my experience as a grad student was like, you weren't really supposed to talk about starting companies. Bob Langer, he's done that. If you want to do that, go talk to Bob. And it was not really a common or encouraged thing. If you asked all other students in my PhD cohort what they wanted to do after they finished their PhD, I guarantee all of them says become a professor or like some kind of nebulous industry thing. No one said start a company. By the time I left MIT, everyone wanted to start companies, every lab, every professor, every student, and probably more than should be starting. The only thing that changed over that period, and this was 2012 through 2018, was culture. So it wasn't like some massive thing happened, like the computer was invented or something. It went from not necessarily taboo, but not really an encouraged thing and not a thing you were supposed to talk about, to a thing that everyone was thinking about how to get their work out into the world in the form of these startups. So I realized from that observation that culture has everything to do with it, and it can change really rapidly. Over 5 years, you could have this inflection from basically 0% to like 100% of people thinking about starting companies from their work. Which, by the way, doesn't mean that every single science project should become a company. That's not what I'm claiming, but I just think that there's a lot of white space there for things. Given that culture is the main driver of this, what happened during COVID was that although I think places like MIT had made that transition around the time I was there, like 2012 to 2018, that did not happen in many other places, many other top research universities. It was still very unusual to talk about starting a company. What happened during COVID was that the walls between all these institutions fell. Everyone was on the internet. It didn't matter where you were. There was also probably, to be honest, a lot of bored grad students because they couldn't really be in the lab. And so they're just like at home thinking about what they should be doing. That might be a good time to reconnect with your friend from undergrad who's now at this other place. It starts to repool everybody. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't matter if you're not in Boston or San Francisco. No matter where you are, it's as if you're in Boston, San Francisco. And just that culture of starting these companies, I think, ballooned everywhere. So I think that was a huge catalyst. You mentioned Nucleate was formed during that period, for example. I think a big reason why Nucleate was initially just in Boston, grew worldwide, was because of the virtual environment that was created in that time.
Yeah, I find it super interesting that you mentioned culture because it's totally true. It's like on the IT computation side, I don't know when that culture began, when it's like, oh, we can learn how to program so we can start companies. But it just seems like that's been going on for 30 years or 20 years, whatever. But like this thing in the life sciences is so new.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the culture as well. It seems like from your background, you're really community oriented. You saw that working on the edge of research, being able to convert the right research into a product, into getting into market, and being able to get people that were thinking along the same lines. You've really done a great job of navigating that through your education, through your academic experience, then Petri, and then Pilar, and your background. And the COVID thing, for sure, being able to reach farther because everyone was online. I saw you at the founder-led Pilar Summit. I'm sorry if I'm what is it called again? Founder-led Summit?
Basically, right. Yeah, we had this event in New York. We had events in 4 cities, in London, San Francisco, New York, and Boston. And I hope we'll do more next year. Oh, that's cool. You got the shirt on.
I got the shirt on. But that's 2023. And 2022, you did it virtually.
Yeah, that was the first year that we had done anything in person.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Thanks.
Like the 2022, even though the virtual one, I was like, you leveraged all the tools. It was a production. You held it down because you were the host of it. Had everyone from all over the world participate. One of the companies that I learned of through the founder-led summit that was virtual in 2022 was Tratomic, who we talk to regularly, thanks to that platform. And then there's a lot of other companies that we've spoken with because of that virtual summit. And then the founder-led tour that was in person, which was also a very great experience, continues to create that culture and allow it to really blossom. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about this founder-led movement. Why founder-led? What prompted you to focus on the person versus the technology, which oftentimes does happen when we talk about startups? And how do you continue to foster that founder-led culture?
Sure. I mean, there's a bunch to unpack there. A lot of what we talk about is the context in which this has evolved, but let me just say it more explicitly. If you went back in the history of biotech, first biotech company, Genentech, which coined the term or something, right? That was started by a venture capitalist at a Kleiner Perkins and a professor. The company was started, it hired a bunch of grad students and postdocs from the professor's lab, but it wasn't really led by the scientists. And Herb Boyer, who was the originator of the technology, went to remain a professor through the whole trajectory. And you fast forward to today, and that's exactly what I was observing in 2012 when I started my PhD, and everyone's like, oh, I want to go permanent professor. Even if they want to start companies, it was often like I would become the Herb Boyer style, like I would be a professor and like spin a company out of my lab. And similarly, if you look at the venture environment, that's the style of many of the biotech investors. They would partner with academics and start companies that they would often either run themselves in the style of flagship pioneering or third act ventures, something like that, or they would hire in their own trusted management teams. And often the scientists remain in academia. Now, why was that? What happened in 2014, 15 or something like that caused this kind of explosion of scientists wanting to leave academia and start their own companies? There's many different factors, but let me draw one story around it. So I had a friend in my PhD named Mark Smith. Now, Mark, I remember talking, we're academics, and I remember making a comment or something like, it's going to be 20 years or something before any of our work sees real impact in patients or something like that, or like really saves a life. I said something like that. And Mark was like, what are you talking about? My work's in people like right now. I saved someone's life last week. And I was like, what are you talking about? And Mark had started, it's this crazy story, which I don't know if you guys have followed, but he had started the first public stool bank called Open Biome. There had been this observation around what ways of curing C. diff infections or other kind of diseases of the gut, where you could actually take, for lack of a better way of describing it, you'd actually transplant feces from a healthy donor into the recipient. And in that time, Eric Alm's group, where Mark worked, was one of the leading labs that was doing this. And Mark was one of the first to recognize, why don't we create a public bank of quality controlled stool to scale this? And they saved many lives through that work and ultimately started a company called Finch Therapeutics. It was shocking to see someone that was doing work that was saving people's lives right then and there. And you just realize, like, whoa, we're in the field of biological engineering. Like, isn't the point of this that we're supposed to shorten these timelines dramatically, the mission that we're all on? And I think that was actually coming true. A lot of people were like, oh, maybe I don't spend a 20-year academic journey like making this thing ready for prime time. It's ready for prime time now. I'm going to start a company and go do it. And that's the highest impact thing that I could do. And so you just saw this explosion of people that wanted to take that next step with bringing their technologies into the world and lead it. The reason we called it quite literally founder-led biotechs is because most of the time, these biotech companies that you hear about in the news are like not led by their founders. They're led by a professional CEO and controlled by VCs, as opposed to led by the scientists who created the technology. That's not to say that that's the only way to do it or a better way to do it or something like that. But I think it was like a fairly new movement that has been happening. We were recognizing this and seeing it within our work and just seeing that this was exploding. We created the summit to point this out instead of going to these conferences where you hear from the luminaries of the field who've been doing it for 30 years and you hear like these investors and so on. It's like, no, let's hold up the examples of people who have just started on their journey and are doing it now. I think that they are the ones that will inspire many more in their footsteps. So in terms of closing this gap of 86,000 active NIH grant projects to 200 companies, I really believe the best way to solve that gap is by holding up the examples of people that are doing it. So we had this summit where we just tried to show the world, here are the people that are doing it. We did that virtually every year since 2021. But last year we thought this just become a global movement. Let's just go unite all the people in these various cities. And we're a limited team. There's only 3 people on our biotech team at Pillar, and we couldn't do it everywhere. But we decided let's pick 4 cities, San Francisco, New York, Boston, and London, and hold events there. And I think next year we'll do even bigger than that. But try and bring out all these examples of people and get people together in person, because that's how you're going to inspire many more people in their footsteps.
I'm trying to think of who it is that says, if you want to solve a lot of problems, get people to start a lot of companies. That's really the way that we solve major problems, is like by encouraging entrepreneurship. And I think what you guys are doing at Pillar, what Nucleate is doing, is super, super important, because we've got some big problems in front of us, not just on the healthcare side, but on the planetary side. A lot of those things are going to be solved through the creation of companies led by, as you say, science founders. But is that the primary type of company that you guys are funding at Pillar? What's the criteria you guys consider when you're evaluating a company to make an investment in?
Yeah, well, I would say we see it as our mission to really close that gap. And the way that we think about it is, number one, create this global community of biotech founders. 2, open source the knowledge and network that everyone has to make this available to every scientist with a great idea. And the third thing is put our investing dollars to work. So we do back a good share of companies. Our direct investment development program with Nucleate, that we provide startup capital to teams with Nucleate, and we have various other things that we've done as well to give people startup capital to be their first line of support as they leave academia. There are companies that we're more heavily invested in. So I think that's one aspect of it. But there's another aspect, which is obviously our money only goes so far. And so we've really tried to create an ecosystem of investors around this movement. And I've been really pleased to see just like how many other people share this vision now. And in terms of what makes something a particular fit for us, I think we really like to invest in companies that are building towards a particular vision of the future that we share. Maybe one way of describing that would be our point of view on why we are in this massive opportunity and why biology is changing so rapidly is we're gradually unlocking the ability to read and write biology at every layer of the system. So if you were to go back to the history of biotech and look back at Genentech, like what was the core innovation there? It was really about the ability to read and write DNA, even in small bits. It was not like insulin, EPO, like these are things that we knew were actually great. Like there are a bunch of diabetic patients being treated with cow and pig insulin. It was just the ability to produce insulin that was the main innovation. And so you have the ability to read the DNA to produce insulin, and you have the ability to write it into an organism, into microbes that can then produce the insulin that was made as a therapeutic for diabetic patients. So now if you fast forward to like where we are today and you ask, well, what is changing today? I mean, biological systems are DNA, RNA, protein, cells, organisms, even whole ecosystems. That's what's so magical about them is the ability to make small changes at one layer and see it propagate all the way through a whole organism or whole ecosystem. And we're now getting the ability to read every layer of the system and write every layer of the system. So what do I mean by reading? There are, I think, tremendous advancements that are being made in the ability to not just read DNA, companies like Illumina and so on, but also to read protein or to read the chemistry that powers life. And we made investments there. There's single cell RNA-seq was like a major advancement in the field as well. There's now abilities to read populations at scale. I think we have something on the order of 500,000 people sequenced now around the world. And then on the right side, if you look at what would it mean instead of writing DNA, but to write to RNA, we have a company called Amber, which invented the field of splice editing, which allows you to write 2 kilobase stretches of RNA. What would it mean to like write to your immune system? We have a company called Thymine that basically can rewrite your immune system. So we have various writing technologies that we think unlock a lot of potential as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. I was going to ask some of the companies that are in your portfolio, but I'm actually curious, what are some of the companies that you're looking for? And I know you don't want to pigeonhole yourself, but are there companies that you're keeping your eyes open for?
We are definitely driven by the best science. Like I said, what unlocks, we really do look for these categorical unlocks of being able to go from 0 to 1 in the way that you can measure or manipulate and engineer a biological system for any application. It doesn't have to necessarily be medicine. And we've invested quite broadly in companies that are working on everything from producing cotton to cheese as well. But in terms of areas I will say that I am particularly interested in, I think one thing to watch closely is, okay, if you look at the development of biotechnology, like any field, you'd expect to start in the areas where you can get the most value per product. And that would make sense. You would want to start with therapeutics. If it costs you a lot of time and money to develop the product, you want something that generates $1 billion a year in revenue. Great. Now, I think anyone that's followed drug development would say, like, yeah, we're getting better and better at curing disease. There's less to do, and the bar is going up at the FDA for safety and so on. It's getting harder and harder to do drugs. I mean, they're still extremely profitable from a business point of view. But the question would be, like, as costs are coming down for developing new biotechnologies, where's the crossover point for other applications that aren't drugs, like making foods or making applications in agriculture or making materials? All these other applications. And you can imagine there are some that are not quite generating $1 billion per product per year or something like that. You could do in drugs, but are maybe doing that 100 million or 10 million or 1 million or 100,000 or something like that. And so we are watching closely at where our applications opening up along that curve of development. We've made several investments, but one area that I think is pretty underexplored by the field is animal healthcare. I don't know the numbers globally, but I do know the numbers offhand for dogs. There are 80 million dogs in the United States, which is astounding. There's roughly 300 million people, and there's like 80 million dogs. The average dog owner spends, say, something like $2,000 a year on their dogs, but like half of them spend more than that. I mean, if you multiply those numbers together, that's an enormous market that rivals. It's maybe like, let's say it's about a tenth the size of that $500 billion a year are spent on pharmaceuticals. Like maybe there's 50 billion or something that's spent in animal healthcare broadly, not necessarily just on drugs. So I think that there's actually tremendous opportunity there. And as you imagine the cost curve of developing a new medicine comes down, like perhaps we see an explosion in pet healthcare.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We've had Aaron Schacht of Biomedit. I don't know if you know him. They look at animal health through the microbiome and develop therapeutics for that. And then we also had Cressalon, Joe Landolina. They make a wound care application. They started a veterinary application, but now going to humans, because that is a strategy that some people use, is that they develop medicines and products for animals because it's less regulated or less red tape. And then once they have a footing, they go into human health. That's for our listeners to get some more background on our animal health episodes, definitely the Biomedit and the Cressalon episodes. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's another tip for our listeners too. If there's any animal health companies you might want to apply to Pillar. So I have this WhatsApp group. It's a biotech group based out of India. So there's a bunch of founders, VCs that are in it. A lot of them are based in Bangalore, which is a biotech hub there. I mean, it's fascinating. I visited it. They're doing everything across the board. I'm sure some similar things that you see in Boston and other cities that you visited. But that would be an interesting place to have your founder-led biotech tour. I mean, I'd be happy to join you if that's something that you want to put on your list. But if you want to go farther away, but have you seen an uptake in applications from all over the world and places that you might not think of?
Well, absolutely. We started to see maybe 18 months or 2 years ago, or a huge amount of inbound from London, Oxford, Cambridge. And we've actually made 3 investments there now. And last year we did have our tour in London. And I think that's only going to grow. I think the UK has a tremendous history of great science and great academic work and in their entrepreneurial endeavors. So I think there's a natural fit there. I will say actually India, Latin America in particular, as 2 places that we tend to definitely get a lot of inbound from. And we're never quite sure, just out of lack of understanding of those markets, like not exactly sure. None of us have on the ground experience there. So never really sure what to do with that. But perhaps we should go together.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here for you.
And I'm curious, Tony, where do you see biotech? I mean, it sounds like you guys are looking at things that's beyond just healthcare or biopharma. You've made investments in food. But what do you see biotech's role in addressing some of the pressing global problems that we're facing?
Well, I think it would be what I described about, I think the cost of developing any given product, I think are coming down quite rapidly across the spectrum. And at the same time, the world is biological. I mean, not just our health is biological, the foods that we eat, all of these other materials that we use, chemicals we could produce, like it's all biological. So I do think that there's going to be tremendous application of biotechnology to all these other areas. We already have some great investments in mostly food, but also in carbon credits. But yeah, I think that's really the tip of the iceberg. I do expect there's going to be an explosion there as the cost curves come down.
I'm interested in the carbon credits. I mean, you'll talk about the company if you can, if you want, but in terms of carbon credits, there's been several players, but hasn't really caught fire yet in terms of a lot of people employing carbon credit system that at least I haven't seen it. I mean, I'm not examining this space, but can you shed some light on what you see is working in the carbon credit world? Like, how do you see it play out?
Well, okay. Well, I will give you a non-answer to that, which is, I mean, the way I think about it is, at least purely from an investment point of view, I do think it makes sense to make bets of which there may be a small probability of being true, but if true, lead to huge outcomes. And I think that's definitely true. Like in the carbon credits market today, like, yes, the United States is purely a voluntary market. Personally, I'm not the one to comment on what forces have to be at play to create a compliance market, but should there be a compliance market for carbon credits, meaning businesses are forced to offset their carbon by buying carbon credits on the market, then you'd imagine that technologies that cheaply create these carbon credits are going to be extreme value. But what exactly needs to happen from a policy point of view to create that, I couldn't, I don't know. Unfortunately. Do you?
Yeah, no, that's something that we've been thinking about and talking with, because we talk to a lot of biomaterials companies on here and they're trying to get the cost down, but they can never compete with petrol derived materials. And it just seems that either people will just have to be willing to pay a premium price, or there has to be a carbon credits model that is regulated and enforced. It just seems like there has to be a huge shift in thinking and acceptance on the true cost of creating products when it's coming from, obviously, the amount of carbon or pollution, or like the whole ESG. I'm doing air quotes because I know a lot of people just say the ESG framework isn't really working. No one's really reporting anything correctly. So it just seems that If there was a true carbon credits model, then a lot of these biomaterial companies, all these companies that we have on this podcast can really have a chance to compete in the market against petrochemical derived products. But that's where I stand. And I'm just thinking of what could that be?
I think a business by which the only business is the carbon credits that it generates is probably not, it's as cheap a commodity as you can get, because the $10 to $100 a ton or something like that. There's not a lot of the things in the world that you produce at $10 to $100 a ton, especially when you're doing something as hard as like pulling carbon out of the air or something analogous to that. So I think definitely, yeah, I would not recommend that as being the single line of business that someone should achieve. And in the cases where we are investing in climate biotech, I would say there's a business model, like you said, where we believe that like we are creating a better product that people are either willing to pay a premium for, or is actually, in several cases, our companies actually cheaper than the existing product. And then also has this externality of being able to derive some carbon credits from that.
Yeah, I'm curious, how many companies have you invested in so far? And of those companies, what percentage is biopharma versus climate biotech versus biotech other?
Sure. I mean, at this point, our portfolio is like well over 50 companies. I would say about a third of those are our core positions where we've taken a larger investment and may have a role on the board. And then I'd say what we do is about half therapeutics in various modes, maybe about 25% in research tools or other ways of creating products for biotech companies. And then maybe 25% what I would put as the broadly other bucket, which would not only be some of the climate biotech related things, but definitely they're in there.
Okay, cool. And again, I meet a lot of startups, and then I told them that I'm going to be interviewing you, and they're like, "Can you connect me to him?" And I'm like, I'm like, let me ask Tony. But what's the best way for startups to connect with you or Pillar, or to be able to share the project or their startup idea with you or Pillar?
Sure. I mean, people should just email me at tony@pillar.vc.
Simple as that. How many startups do you see? You're so open.
I would say we probably see between 600 and 800 per year, something like that.
Amazing.
And you guys have 3 people on your team.
Well, Pillar in itself is a team of about 15 people. Our dedicated bio team is 3 within that 15.
You guys are doing a lot of work, a lot of good work. Very, very impressive. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, that's very kind words. We're trying hard.
Where are we going to see you throughout the year? I know you just had a little baby, so I'm sure you're busy, but
Yeah, definitely not traveling as much over the next 6 months. So yeah, I'm not really super sure yet. I definitely prefer to just call people directly rather than make the trips out to conferences if I can.
when we post this podcast, if you get an influx of emails, I'm sorry and you're welcome.
Yeah.
Oh, no. I mean, I love getting emails from people. That's what I love to do. I wouldn't do this if I didn't love getting emails. So please email me.
Great. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Tony. It was a pleasure. We'll definitely have you back on, see what other companies you're seeing, all the research that you're seeing. It's just a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Tony. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Erum, what do you think of this interview with Tony Kulesa? You said so many great things about him in the intro, and I thought the interview was just stellar.
Yeah, I really loved hearing his story. I think many of our listeners who are in academia, who are PhDs, they could relate to it because there's common challenges that academics face, right? You create something new in a lab, you discover something, but what are the chances of commercialization for you or for your university? As many times when you create something in a university setting, and it's owned by the university. And I know there's some universities that have tech transfer offices and that facilitate a culture of entrepreneurship, but some don't. And this is what Tony was really getting at. And his call to action was, how could he create a culture of entrepreneurship in academia? And he was amongst some of the most brilliant people at MIT, being in Boston, amongst the Harvards of the world. How can you facilitate that? And he was coming at it from years ago when he was in the lab, when he was in college. And there has been a shift in terms of students seeing that they do have one option for them after graduating is starting a company. It's not just going to get their PhD or becoming a PI or becoming a professor and going back into academia. Like, how do you actually make a larger impact? Of course, you're making impact as a professor amongst students, and those students go on to do things. But sometimes you have a disposition to actually see your work get into the market. So I really, really loved his story on how he thought about commercializing science and how he worked with students and how he started Petri first and then Pillar then absorbed Petri into their ecosystem.
To me, the big message of the interview with Tony is academia or university, no matter how high up you go, doesn't really train people to get a job. I've always said that. School teaches you to go to school. It doesn't teach you how to get a job. So if you're a brilliant scientist, until now, you're generally not being exposed to this idea that you could actually start a company. So Pillar and Nucleate are huge, very much needed resources. And I think the other programs that Tony runs at Pillar, the founder-led Biotech Summit, Frequency Bio, their Wave Summit for supporting women and underrepresented genders in biology, are very much needed. And I'm always happy when we have people from these communities on to talk about what the possibilities are, because we know we have a lot of grad students, undergrads who are listening to this podcast who are maybe thinking they might want to go into entrepreneurship or they might want to join a startup. We need to make people aware that the world is not just you get your PhD and then you go into academia. Those jobs are few and far between.
Yeah, exactly. And all of that knowledge and talent, how do you keep it rather than vaporize because the person who has a PhD is doing something completely different, or it just stays within the walls of academia and not necessarily in the hands of other people that are very interested in the work that they were doing and the work that they did during their academic career. My mind is going to our friend Michael Fisher of DSci, because he talks a lot about how the mechanics and infrastructure of science has to change through decentralized science. But again, that's another podcast. We should have him on.
Yeah, I think we should.
He's definitely a fun guy.
Yeah, I think it would be good to have him talk, especially after the last session at SymBioBeta being about DSci and funding mechanisms, because the funding mechanism is broken. I did take that away from the event I was at yesterday. There's a lot of money out there. It's sitting on the sidelines. There's a lot of scientists who are doing great stuff that are not getting their message to these investors. And there's a chasm between early stage discovery and the kind of money you can get from the government and the money you get from VCs to commercialization. People are suggesting that DSci fit in, but there's a lot of opportunity. So I think we should have Michael on to talk about this stuff.
And clearly there's a gap. The funding event that you went to in New York City has demonstrated that there's a gap of understanding of what's happening in the market. And in this regard, how AI is being used to further help us understand biology and create compounds to treat disease. I think it's funds like Pillar VC, people like Tony, and we had Elliot Hirschberg on a few episodes ago, who are focusing on biology. They're very hyper-focused on biology in general, not just very specifically in biopharma. They are taking a 10,000-foot view of biology, which is absolutely necessary, and taking the tools of today and using it from a high level to go down into a very specific disease is what this world needs. We just need to have a better understanding so we don't have all these side effects, or we're only focusing on one type of person. So there's a lot. I'm getting a little verklempt here.
I feel like we've been very biopharma heavy today. And what people should understand is that all these technologies that have been developed and have been applied to biopharma, well, the reason we have this podcast is to look at the other ways these technologies are being applied to make the world a better place. So I had a couple of conversations last night at this event with people. I mentioned the podcast, and I also mentioned some of the companies that we've interviewed, and the company that got the biggest reaction was Biomason. How come I don't know about a company that is growing brick? So shout out to Ginger and Biomason. Woo! And I mentioned Prometheus. Lauren Burnett was on the podcast early on, and these people's just eyes lit up. And I said, yeah, there's this whole other world where biotech is being applied to solve very real problems. And unfortunately, the biopharma investors typically don't know that much about that. So that's another reason why we have this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think that's a pod. I think it's just worth reminding people. We do have a Patreon. We'd love you to be a part of this community. We love getting your feedback. Being part of this community is like having coffee with your friends in biotech. We appreciate all of you around the world that have written to us and have told us what you like about the podcast. We're always open for new suggestions.
Yes, please support us and we will support you.
I think that's the pod.
See you later.